You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host today. We are reviewing a new book, Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia, by Professor Khairudin Aljunied. Professor Aljunied is an associate professor at the National University of Singapore and senior fellow previously at Malaysia Chair of Islam in Southeast Asia at the Alwaleed Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. He is the author of several books, including Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Southeast Asian Islam in Comparative Perspective, Hamka and Islam, Cosmopolitan Reform in the Malay World, Cornell University, and Islam in Malaysia. And of course, his latest publication, which is Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia, which we'll be discussing in detail today. The book attempts to capture the progressive and pluralistic nature of Islamic reform in Southeast Asia from the mid-20th century onwards by focusing on 7 prominent figures from the region. This is, of course, a MEMO conversation, so we will be looking into relations between the Middle East and the 7 intellectuals covered in the book. Okay, let's leave that out.
Going to be edited.
Going to be edited.
Oh, okay.
That's fine. So we'll cut that out.
Yeah.
So I've got the intro. They'll cut it.
Once it's edited, they'll upload to YouTube.
Okay.
Okay. They've got a massive reach.
Let me see you inside. All right.
I think I can stand here. I'll do it this way. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, that's good. Is the angle okay?
I think the angle's okay.
All right.
What do you think? Do you know? Just come. Have a look.
Perfect. I think it's good.
Yeah.
So we should look more relaxed, I guess.
Yeah.
More relaxed
Take
conversation.
it easy.
Just relax, take it easy.
Yeah.
So, Professor Khairudin, let's begin by talking about the book itself and what motivated you to write this particular book. You have authored a number of books. Why this particular one? And what's the main ideas and themes behind the book?
Yeah. So basically, this book, Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia, is the 4th in a series of books that gives an alternative perspective on Islam in Southeast Asia. And what I wanted to do in all of these books, and a 5th one is actually coming out at the end of this year, is to show that Islam in Southeast Asia is a cosmopolitan form of Islam, where Muslims and non-Muslims could get along well in society. There is a culture of plurality and inclusivity, and that there are strands of intellectual thought within Southeast Asia that has not been fully considered by other thinkers from other parts of the world. So the subtext of what I'm trying to do with all these books is to bring the attention of scholars on Islam and Islamic studies to look at a neglected terrain in the world of Islam, which is Southeast Asia. So Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia is an attempt to show how 7 intellectuals propounded and expressed certain ideas that are very, very progressive, far ahead, to my mind, than what we see in many parts of the Muslim world, and that they should be considered seriously by scholars studying the rest of the Muslim world today.
Of course, there's more than 7 intellectuals and academics in a region which is the most populous Muslim region in the world. So why did you pick those 7 in particular? Why not many others? What is distinct about them which made you want to focus on them?
Interesting, because many people I spoke to have already read the book. They are a bit unhappy that I didn't include certain figures. For example, the founder of Muhammadiyah, a 40 million strong movement in Indonesia, Ahmad Dahlan, is considered as a shaper of Islam in Southeast Asia. There were certain reasons why I chose these 7. And the first is I was very much concerned with the kind of ideas that they tried to develop that gave an alternative perspective of Islam as it has been manifested and articulated by Muslims in Southeast Asia. So I was looking at figures like Naqib al-Atas, Sayyid Naqib al-Atas, who talks about the need for us to desecularize society. So many of these thinkers, the criteria for selection is the controlling idea that drives a lot of their writings, and how these controlling ideas or the key concepts, the key ideologies that they were putting out were in a sense very advanced, and that they express it through many, many writings. So each of these thinkers would have written at least 5 to around 20 books. And in many of these books, you see a cumulative form of expression of what Islam is supposed to be in Southeast Asia. So one other reason why I chose these 7 is that many of them were also involved in social movements. So I'm not interested only in intellectuals or thinkers or scholars who were writing from the ivory towers. I'm interested with thinkers and scholars whose ideas basically were used by movements of the day. And when we talk about a figure like Zakia Darajat, a woman who got her PhD, the first Southeast Asian woman to get a PhD from the Ain Shams University in Egypt. And she was part and parcel of the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, which is a council of Indonesian scholars. And she was very much also involved in many civil society movements of her time. So I was looking at the interaction between their activities on the ground, their grounded activism, with the ideas that they were expressing in an attempt to basically show that it's not enough for us to look at people who write a lot, but people who write things that impacted society in one way or another. And that's why I call them shapers, people who not only shaped the terrain of ideas, but who also shaped societies of their time.
Yeah, I mean, we will go into a bit more detail about the actual questions they're trying to address and answer, which is, I think, quite generic amongst many reformists in the Muslim world, the kind of key fundamental questions which they're trying to address and deal with. We'll get to that. But as I said at the beginning, that this is a Middle Eastern podcast, and I wanted to ask, what influence and impact has the Middle East had in the shaping of the thinking of the 7 intellectuals that you address? Because one of the issues I think I took from your book is that you seem to have a bit of a gripe with the fact that the Muslim world somehow is centered around the Middle East, and there's so much going on in the periphery, in Malaysia, Indonesia, even places like Bangladesh, which is one of the most populous Muslim countries in the world. And you have, I think rightfully so, you have a bit of a frustration about the fact that Islam, when we speak about Islam, it's always Middle Eastern centered, and the transmission of knowledge is from the Middle East to the rest of the Muslim world, and that's a problem I think you have, and I heard many other people share and express as well. So that said, what is the connection? Does the Middle East, Middle Eastern politics shape and influence their thought in any shape or form?
Well, there is no doubt that the Middle East has had and still is influencing many parts of the Muslim world. And that is something that we cannot deny, because we have to understand that Islam is a religion of circulation. It is a global religion, but it circulates from one region to another. There are 7 to 8 regions where Muslims are predominant, and Southeast Asia is just one of them. But that anything that happens in one part of the world affects other parts of the world. We always see that the Middle East has influenced Southeast Asia, but the reality is that Southeast Asia has also influenced the Middle East. So in as much as we are basically saying that the Arabs or the Middle East and North African regions have certain bearing over Southeast Asian thought, what I am saying in the book, it is not just one way. There is this movement in and out. There is this consumption of Arabic-based ideas, and there is a transformation of these ideas to fit into the local context, and also exportation of ideas from Southeast Asia to the rest of the world. So I think the whole book is really trying to make the case for a new way of conceptualizing the movement of ideas in the Muslim world. And of course, I'm not the first to say this. There are many works right now that are coming out talking about the circulation of Islam all over the world. But somehow Southeast Asia has been neglected. And the reason for this is that there is this idea, and I call it the diffusionist theory of Islam, where scholars assume that Southeast Asians were not creative producers of their own. That is that whenever ideas from the Middle East come into Southeast Asia, all the Southeast Asian had done is basically to translate these ideas and operationalize it in their own societies. That is not the case. What they did was to give these ideas a lot of thought, reconceptualize, repackage, and rethink the whole architecture of these ideas, and then express it in their own unique ways in their own societies. Again, I would like to emphasize that many of the concerns of the Southeast Asian thinkers are the same concerns that Middle Eastern thinkers, South Asian thinkers, African thinkers have had for a long, long time. What is interesting about these thinkers that I looked at in the book is that they try to mediate between the concerns that they have at the local level with the global so-called currents and influences that are out there. So they're trying to find a middle path in trying to be, in a sense, more in tune with issues in their own context, with the issues that were happening all over the Muslim world.
If I can just focus on that question again, but in the Middle East, a lot of the reformist movements and intellectuals appeared, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So was that a trigger for a lot of these reformists in the Southeast as well? Did the breakup of the Ottoman Empire make them think and deeply about what is the role of Islam in our country? What's the relationship between Islam and the state? Is that also the reason the collapse of the Ottoman Empire? Did that have an impact in their thought?
This is an interesting question, and actually a lot of work, especially by Anthony Milner, he had looked at the impact of the fall of the Ottoman Empire on Southeast Asia. There were some reactions, but in general, the kind of reaction that you see in Southeast Asia was not the same as what we saw in India, for example, the Khilafat movement in India, and more so in the Arab world. Southeast Asians were very, very much affected by the fact that the Caliphate was no longer around by 1924. But there was a recognition that in Southeast Asia itself, there were kingdoms that were interestingly preserved by the colonial powers. So the anxiety wasn't as deep as what we see in other parts of the world. That's one explanation. But the other thing is that there is some kind of independence amongst people in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis the larger caliphate, as we want to say it. In as much as they affiliate.
Can you just explain that, the larger caliphate? What do you mean by
the larger caliphate? Because the Ottomans and all the other caliphates that existed before claimed themselves to be the universal caliphate. They are the representative, or the caliph is the representative of Muslims all over the world. For a long time, for a few hundred years, the Ottomans played quite an influential role in Southeast Asia. The Acehnese, when they were fighting against the Dutch, would call upon the Ottoman Sultan to send troops into Southeast Asia, and so did during the rebellions in Java and so forth and so forth. But then by the 20th century, a lot of Muslims in Southeast Asia found that the Ottomans were not to be relied upon, and they realized that we need to now take control of what we are doing. Hence the rise of new movements such as Muhammadiyah, which, in as much as they respected the Ottoman Empire, they realized that we need to now craft our own destinies, our own future, our own Islam that is not based on the Ottoman idea of Islam, but our own Southeast Asian conceptualization of it. And the same is with other big movements such as Nahdlatul Ulama, and in Malaysia, there was this reformist movement called the Al-Imam movement. So again, yes, the fall of the Ottoman was something that affected Muslims all over the world, but no, it did not affect Southeast Asians as much as what you can see in the Arab world.
And on that, just one last question: that Zionism and Israel's colonization of Palestine played a major role in the thinking of many Islamist thinkers and reformers, you can say, in addition to pushing back against secularism, pushing back against colonialism and Western influence. These are all, big ideas or big forces in Islamic thinking. So in the Far East, how much of an influence or impact did the occupation of Palestine by Israel have in their thinking?
Well, there were a lot of discussions in a lot of the periodicals in Southeast Asia during the start of the Zionist occupation, especially at the beginning of the Nakba in 1948, and following which was the war in 1967. A lot of reaction also from intellectuals. But again, as I read through the 7 intellectuals that I examined in the book, one of them at least did mention a little bit about what happened in Israel, or now, well, of course, we know as Palestine, the creation of Israel. But for the large part, and this is very interesting actually, they were not that concerned with just that issue in the Muslim world. Because to them, yeah, the Palestinian issue is a major issue. But this is just one of the many crises that the Muslim world was currently faced with. And
symptom of a bigger disease.
Yeah, a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is the lack of education, the lack of ability to ensure that there is justice in social justice, and then the issue of cooperation between Islamic nations, which is a big thing, the fall or the inability of transnational coalitions to come together to defend Muslims, not only in Palestine, but in other parts of the Muslim world. So I guess they are sophisticated enough to understand that, yeah, we have a problem or an issue to handle with when it comes to one of the sacred sites of Islam. But then, in as much as that issue is seen as a sacred issue, as a big issue in the Ummah, it is not the only issue that we should pay a lot of attention to. And in fact, one of the thinkers, Kunto Wijoyo, stressed on the importance for us to be historically aware of how we got here, what happened to Palestine. And he wrote a little bit on this, has to do with a long history of neglect, of the inability of Muslims to ensure that their own lands are taken care of by themselves. And he talks about, as Malik bin Nabi said, it is not that we were colonized. That's just half of the story. We made ourselves colonizable. And Kunto Wijoyo spoke about this, and other thinkers as well, that Muslims had opened themselves up to being able to be dominated by others. Hence, the issue of Palestine came into the picture.
Earlier, you spoke about that transmission wasn't just one way, Middle East to the Far East, Malaysia, Indonesia. There's also transmission from the periphery to the core. So what are the key ideas you think which the 7 intellectuals discuss and talk about that would be useful to the Middle East if those ideas were imported? I mean, one of the individuals you cover is Cesar Adib, who you describe as the integrationist. So he lives in the Philippines, I think, where Muslims are a minority. So again, you can speak about Palestine, where Muslims are a minority, Palestinians are a minority, where there's ongoing conflict. So what are the lessons which Cesar can impart to that region, which could help them to navigate and come out of the ongoing tension and conflict that's been happening in the region? So not just Cesar, but some of the other individuals you cover. What are the key ideas, key values and principles which you think, if imported to the region and the rest of the Muslim world and the world in general, could be useful?
Yeah, so Cesar is the most interesting person when it comes to minority-majority relations. And what he was concerned with is first the master narrative of the nation. And he says, in regard to the Muslims in the Philippines, which is in a sense not much of a difference with the Muslims in Palestine or the Palestinians as a whole, is that we first need to address the issue of how the nation is narrated in many of the textbooks. And he talks about how we need to reinterpret the history to begin with, because the struggles of minorities have always been the struggle of defining their past. And if that past is defined in the terms of the victims, then it will not be the past that can construct a new identity for these people who are seen as minorities. That's the first. So to reclaim that past again, and this is the big point that he was emphasizing. The second actually is the issue of community. And he was talking about the Muslims of his time who saw themselves only as a distinct community that is supposed to be separate from the rest of the nation. And he's saying that, yeah, we can do that if we were in the pre-colonial world where Muslims had their sultanates and their kingdoms, but now we are in the world of nations. How then do we define this whole idea of a community if we see ourselves, according to Cesar, as only Muslim community, racially different, culturally different from the rest of the population? Then we will always be the outsiders in that nation. He was saying that we need to make the concept of community more open, inclusive, to allow people whom the Filipino Muslims once saw as colonizers. This is very interesting because there were a lot of battles between the Moros, Muslims, they were called Moros in the Philippines. Until today, actually, this term is actually used. He said that we need to now try to reconfigure our idea of community such that we can include non-Muslims as part and parcel of our community in order for us to forge stronger partnerships and coalitions to move forward to construct a new nation for everyone. And this is very, very interesting because he is saying basically that the Christians are also minorities in some sense, because there's not only Muslims as minorities, there are many other minority groups. And there are Christian groups that are minorities in Philippines itself. And if we exclude them from our understanding of community, we are making ourselves weaker in the grand narrative of the nation. It's a very sophisticated idea of looking at integration, not integration by way of looking at how the dominant group defines what it means to be part and parcel of a given territory, but rather to look at how different groups can now come together to construct a new reality for Muslims.
So one of the things the state does, the nation state does, is forces individuals and groups to retell the story within the confines of the borders of the nation state. If you can't do that, then of course there'll be tension, there'll be conflict. That's usually what happens. And the country that seems to have done really successfully is Malaysia, where you have 60% Muslims, I think, and you have many minorities in Malaysia. So I think one of the lessons there is look at Malaysia as a model for how we can do integration well, where you have, of course, Muslim majority, but it's not majority like some of the other Middle Eastern countries, but there is no conflict, there is no tension in the way you have civil strife, even civil war we've seen over the last decade or so in Syria and Lebanon, of course, and other parts of the Middle East. So do any of these scholars speak about how countries like Malaysia have been able to glue and gel the various disparate communities into one national body, whereas some of the Middle Eastern countries have not been able to do that? I mean, is there something there in their thinking, in the way they analyze this, which could be imported to parts of the Middle East?
Yeah, so one of the thinkers is actually Ahmad Ibrahim, who interestingly is a lawyer and a legal theorist. And he talks about how we need to then rethink the whole idea of the Sharia. Because, Muslims are predominant in Malaysia and want the Sharia to be the law of the nation. But he's now saying that, okay, we have non-Muslims in this nation. We must consider that they have rights in this nation. How then should we view Sharia? And he says that we need to move away from seeing the Sharia as laws, rather that it is in an ethical code that emphasizes the importance of celebrating differences in society. And that one of the differences is differences in terms of religions, of cultures, of races, of languages. Hence, he said, Malaysia then can move forward to having Muslims emphasizing the fact that they have certain unique laws and ways of life, that at the same time would include the non-Muslims as part and parcel of their entire nation. Now, I want to speak a bit about this whole idea of a nation, because all of these thinkers, they were grappling with this issue. How then can we square the whole idea that we are Muslims and we are supposed to be ummatic, global in our orientation, with the idea of a nation? It doesn't seem to fit together, right? Because Islam stands for...
And every so-called reformist addressed that question, which is one of the key questions in the book as well.
Exactly. So then this is where I say that the interesting thing about these thinkers is that they understood the importance of looking at things from the perspective of mosaic. That, yeah, we can have so many different ideas. We may affiliate ourselves with the struggles of Muslims overseas. But at the same time, that doesn't take away the fact that we can be loyal to a given nation state that we affiliate ourselves with. And this is the tension that they were dealing with. And I feel that they are successful in trying to, in a sense, harmonize these two issues. That you can belong to a given country, to a given place, to a given territorial state, but at the same time, you can still be active, be concerned, be a contributive element of things that are happening overseas, be it Palestine, be it the issues of Rwanda. And I think one of these things that a key takeaway from the book, and which perhaps our Middle Eastern listeners can benefit from, is that we need to also think of issues that are human in nature rather than Islamic and Muslim. And this is why they are saying, all of these thinkers are saying, that once we come to that level of moving away from only being concerned with Islamic issues, we then can build a nation that can accept anybody and everybody. And that is actually the challenges for the Muslims today. We only see things through the Islamic lens. We're not able, or maybe many of us, not all of us, able to see it from this universalist point of view, which Professor Osman Bakar, the epistemologist, I call him in the book, has always been underlining again and again and again, that we became what we are because of the interaction with so many forms of cultures and knowledge. And we need to now pay it forward, bring it back, put it out, and show that we are not only interested with whatever that is happening to our kind, but we would come out and defend and help and assist and speak about things that affect everybody else, such that we can resolve the problems of everyone wherever we are.
I mean, from what you just said, it seems there's a tension within some of these scholars or academics you cover in your books. I have in mind Naqib al-Atas, who seems to be very anti-secular. Some of these solutions or you're describing kind of subscribes to a secular model of polity, where you accept that there are different communities, different religious groups, and you have to find a way to somehow harmonize between that. And that's kind of been the secular project to find a way of living and coexisting with people of different faiths, different communities, something which Atas in your book seems to be opposed to. I mean, am I reading this correctly? So there is a tension, there is a conflict. But as you know, I mean, if I was to quote Charles Taylor, that we are all secularists now. There is no way of escaping that. Secularism is almost, it's like a fish living in water. It's around us. There's our thinking and our way of existence has become secular. Of course, there's a broader definition of secularism, which I don't want to really get into. But it seems there is a tension between. Let me just. They'll edit that out. What point is that? Let me just.
The tension between.
Let me just say which point. They'll find it. Okay. So it seems that there is a tension between the intellectuals you cover in your book in how to create harmony between people of different faiths and different communities.
So, well, the interesting thing about Naqib al-Atas is that he is trying to turn secularism on its own head. That the claims by the secularists that by being secular, you can then be fair, is already a flawed claim, according to him. Because the reality is that secularism as an ideology, according to Naqib Alatas, has not been fair. And it is especially unfair to religions, because the whole foundation of secularism is a battle against against religion. Now, I criticize Naqib Alatas on this, because when we talk about secularism, there are so many models of secularism. We're talking about the laïcité in France, the more fundamentalistic form of secularism in Turkey during the time of Ataturk, and the more modulated, mediated, and soft secularism that you see in Britain, where it's almost like pot puree, right? Everybody can just come together and be part of the society, and we don't have a problem whether you want to be religious or not religious. It's really up to you. So I think philosophically, he's saying that secularism is problematic because the claim of people who are secular or secular thinkers is that religion has its place, but it cannot be predominant in any way, in any society. And to him, simply by saying that, they are anti-religion altogether. And he's right to some extent, but I think it is more complex than that. Now, you mentioned Charles Taylor just now. I think the other thinker that we need to consider is actually Peter Berger, who talks about the post-secularist world that we are in. He spoke about desecularization, and then now he's a lot of thinkers that are influenced by his ideas are talking about the whole idea of living in a post-secular world, where at the time of secularism, as Charles Taylor have it, all of us would say that in the public sphere, we ought not to express our religiosity. Religion should be kept in the private sphere. But Peter Berger is saying that's not at all possible. In as much as we want to swim in this ocean of secularism, the fact is that religions are getting more and more expressive than ever before. It is expressed in the dress code of Muslims and even non-Muslims. It is expressed in the manner to which celebrities celebrate victory in a UFC match. Alhamdulillah, thank God I won this game. And it is expressed in so many things that are happening in public. So Jose Casanova said, we have what we call now public religions. It's no longer a secularist world. It is a world where religion and the secular are now mutually constitutive with one another. And I think this is the right way to think. Naqib Alatas did not reach that point, but his critique to me initiated these discussions over how far can we then take secularism and its applicability in Muslim societies. What he didn't see was that for every antithesis, there will always be an antithesis that will reach to a synthesis. And that's now a synthesis, what Sherman Jackson calls as the Islamic secular, where secularist forms of expressions of nation state, of society, of law, of governance now has Islamic characteristics. You can practically be sworn in as a member of the American Parliament or Senate and swear by the Quran, and nobody has a problem with that, right? Or you can be part and parcel of any company that is so-called secular, public company, and tell your boss, I need to pray. And your boss will say, by all means, we can prepare a space for you. So there is this, in a sense, working together, some symbiosis of Islam, of religions with secularism, bring about now a new dynamic. And a lot of theories are trying to grapple with this. The whole idea that we have become secular is, in a sense, has come to pass.
Yeah, I think in the Middle East, that tension still exists. I think trying to create a nation-state model where religion is kept out of politics, where 90% or more than 90% in most countries are Muslims, it's been a huge problem. You've got autocrats and dictators who do not want to give voice to democracy, fearing that democracy would lead to political Islam coming into government. That seems to be the main problem why we have cycle of violence, cycle of revolutions in the Middle East. So secularism in the Middle East, I mean, I think I want to quote Condoleezza Rice. I think she once said, yes, we need to keep religion out of politics. That's a good thing. But in the Middle East, you have to find a way for allowing Muslims and Muslim parties to be part of politics. You cannot simply close them away or push them aside, as has been happening in the Middle East, and more so following the Arab Spring, where many Muslim parties, the Ikhwan, for example, has been proscribed in many governments. But that surely is a recipe for more tension, more violence in the region. So I think, do you think at the heart of it is that in the Middle East, at the heart of the problem in the Middle East is that question has not been answered properly? How do you harmonize between Islamic parties and Islamic heritage and history with a modern nation state model, with authoritarian regimes who want to basically serve their own interests? And that hasn't been harmonized in the way, say, in Malaysia, there's been a harmony where you have Muslim leaders who advocate for Islam and they're quite confident and proud of their Islam. Anwar, for example. So many others you can cite who are quite confident about the Islam, and there isn't a tension between Muslim parties and the state as such.
Yeah. So I guess the tension doesn't come in because there are intellectual tools that these politicians are working with. And this is something that the Middle East doesn't see. That the reason why Anwar Ibrahim can naturally talk about Islam in a discussion over constitutionalism has to do with the fact that he has read Naguib Alatas. He has read the works of Kunto Wijoyo, of Ahmad Ibrahim, and so forth, and understand that the tension that has been, in a sense, created in the minds of Western theories is not a tension that is in our society, that is in our scholarship. Hence, it becomes a natural thing to fuse religious values, religious ideas with seemingly secular ideals. And I think this is the challenge for the Middle East right now. I mean, you have attempts by some theories like Rashid Ghannouchi to talk about the fact that Islam or religion and secularism can actually work together within the framework of a secular nation state. But then the reaction towards it has always been negative. It is not that the Middle East is lacking of ideas, but it's just that there is, to me, from the little that I know of what's happening on that part of the world, the lack of intellectuals who would engage not only with the level of ideas, but also at the level of movements at the same time. So you have this chasm that is happening right now in the Middle East. In Southeast Asia, many of these people who were in social movements are now in politics. And they can somehow negotiate those tensions. Anwar Ibrahim was part of ABIM, Angkatan Bela Islam Malaysia. And now he's become the prime minister. Before that, he was the deputy prime minister. And he knows how to see in a sense, cleavages within what is seen as secular to talk about what is religious. And I think the Middle East is still coming out of this. They are, to my mind, following what scholars like Asif Bayat has looked at. They are coming out of this secularist or secular versus religion mode now to understand that we are indeed in a post-secular world. This process is a very difficult process. But from what's happening in Turkey right now, you can see that CHP is working with Islamic parties. And this is the first indication that down below or above, there are thinkers now telling secular-based parties that you need to consider Islamic groups, you need to consider Islamic movements. And soon enough, I think Turkey might just lead the way for the rest of the Middle East. I'm quite optimistic. I mean, amidst all of the issues that the country has faced, or criticisms over what's happening in the country, there is an indication that it can be a model taking off from what's happening in Southeast Asia, because I know that Erdogan, for sure, he does look at Southeast Asia as one of his models for the functioning of politics in Turkey. There's a lot of engagements that have been happening, a lot of conferences between the two regions. And they are showing that Islamic parties can work with secular parties.
So one more question, or two more questions before we round up our conversation. So if we assume that, we're all living in a secular age, as Charles Taylor said, so the kind of religion you're describing, or the kind of marriage between religion and secularism you're describing in the Far East, in Malaysia in particular, in Turkey as well, is that realistically, is that the model which can actually deliver for human beings, for their citizens in a secular age? Is that how we should view religion and the role of religion in this post-secular world? Because, as we said, we cannot turn the clock back. We cannot, put the genie back in the bottle. History has unfolded, and we are in a different space, in a different place. And we are living in a society where people are thinking and rationalizing using tools and intellectual ideas, which weren't there 1400 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So given we are living all in a secular age, to quote unquote, do you think that is the model of religion, Turkey, Malaysia, that is viable for the Muslim majority world?
It is to some extent. I mean, much remains to be seen. But again, to take a step back and look at what Charles Taylor has been saying, I disagree that we are living in a secular age. I think we should look at the works of Talal Asad, where he talks about circular formations. There were formations of different kinds of secularism all over the world, and it has never been complete. No society, including Western society, had become completely secular, because religions are still there. People swear by Bibles and things like that. And that when we look at it away from a secular age to a secular formation, then we can see that there's always been this kind of convergence between religion and secularism at any time within Western history, and more so in Southeast Asian history. And this is why, as I was mentioning just now, in Southeast Asia, because the chasm between secularism and religion has not been that far off, hence the harmonization will be easier. And therefore, Southeast Asian can then be a model for the rest of the world. But therein lies the challenge for Southeast Asia. And the reason why I wrote this book has to do with the fact that most thinkers in the book only wrote in the vernacular. And this is our problem, that there is a lack of the globalization of the ideas that are coming out from Southeast Asia for the rest of the world to benefit from. And we suffer from that. The reasons why people do not see Southeast Asia as models for anything really in the Islamic world, except for nasheed and perhaps hijab, because it's a big industry now, has to do, we are only better at popular culture than anything else, has to do with the fact that there is a lack of a translation movement. And I've been appealing to every institution that I could speak to that we need to now translate our ideas into Arabic, into Turkish, into Urdu, so that these different regions all over the world, into Swahili, can benefit from the ideas that we have. And of course, the major language is English, and we need to now write in English. For those who can't write in English, and we have an issue in some countries in Southeast Asia, then it is the task of people like myself, coming from a Muslim minority nation. I mean, the majority of people in Singapore are basically non-Muslims, but we have the benefit of having a good proficiency of English. So we have the responsibility to study these ideas and bring them out. Now, I realize that it's a mammoth task for one person to do it. We're dealing with ideas of a group of 350 million people. But I hope that the way forward in the future would be to inspire more scholars to come in. My own role now is to write as many books as I can. And I think this will start a new wave of rethinking about the Muslim world as a whole, beginning with Southeast Asia.
You do speak a lot about the crisis of knowledge, or the scholars you mentioned, they speak about the crisis of knowledge in the Muslim world. And it's a bit of a shame, I think, if you look at the Muslim world, why there hasn't been more transmission from the periphery to the center, if the Middle East is the center, given that as a model, many of these countries are very successful. Malaysia is, a classic case, Indonesia. So they're grappling with similar issues. They were colonized, but somehow they're middle income countries. They're living in harmony with various minority groups. So it's a shame that we've not been able to have more coming from those regions, ideas to help the Muslim world and the Middle East, navigate a lot of those difficult issues. One last question. So what do you hope will be their legacy, the seven individuals? What would you like to be their legacy for, not just for the Far East, but also for the Muslim world and the Middle East as well? What would you like to be their legacy?
Well, I hope that through all of these writings that I've looked at, there will arise a new form of Islam, which I call in another book, in an early book, a new form of Muslim cosmopolitanism. And we sorely need this right now, because everywhere in the Muslim world, I just came back from Manchester, and the brothers and sisters there were talking about how the caste system is still big in some parts of South Asia amongst Muslims, and we can marry out of our caste, which blows me apart. I mean, like, I couldn't believe that these things actually exist, because we don't have it in Southeast Asia. That's the first thing. But there is a lack of cosmopolitanism within the Muslim community. And this is where I want this new wave of scholarship to emphasize on the fact that we need to learn how to not only coexist, but also melt together our identities, our realities, our societies, our communities, our nations, such that we can build a new civilization that is more open-ended. And this is, I think, the aspiration that most young people have right now. So again, to go back to Asif Bayat, because he does a lot of work on Muslim youth, the young people right now do not want to see what their parents are looking at. They're not interested with which caste, whatever caste you are from. They're not interested with the fact that you're Arab and I'm Southeast Asian, you're Malay, I'm Indonesian. They're not interested even with the nation state. They are interested with causes that would propel themselves and their environment forward. They are interested in animal rights now. They are interested with environmental issues. And we cannot get them to be interested in ideas if our own ideas do not manifest their aspirations. And to me, Muslim cosmopolitanism, which interestingly, Anwar Ibrahim is also talking about it, ABIM has decided to use it as their controlling idea for their movement. Muhammadiyah, 14 million strong, they said, okay, we're going to take this idea because this is a viable thing. What I hope is that this whole idea of Muslim cosmopolitanism, which comes from the Quran, actually from Surah Al-Hujurat, will be taken up by other groups in the Middle East. It is part of our tradition, and Islam has always been embracing of others. We should be embracing of ourselves and our communities.
Thank you, Khairudin, for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you at home for tuning in. Hope to see you in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.